Hey there, deep diving friend. Buckle up, because today we are diving deep into some seriously big ideas. We're talking about the clash of civilizations, and we've got excerpts from Edward Said, a brilliant scholar, taking on this whole concept. Get ready for some serious aha moments. You've got your source material ready, excerpts from Said's essay, The Clash of Ignorance. Let's dive right in. This isn't just some abstract academic debate, this idea that the future of global conflict hinges on cultural divides. It's really captured the public imagination, especially after 9/11. But is it accurate? Is it actually helpful? That's where Edward Said enters the picture. But before we get to Said's critique, let's take a quick step back. For anyone needing a refresher, what exactly is Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis all about?
Well, the basic premise is that future global conflicts won't be about things like ideology or economics. Instead, they'll be about fundamental cultural differences.
So he's saying, get ready for a clash of cultures.
Yeah, and to make it even more stark, Huntington divided the world into these huge categories: Western, Islamic, Hindu, etc. And he argued that these civilizations are hardwired to clash as they compete for power.
And you can see how this idea, right or wrong, really took off after 9/11, right? It's like people were looking for anything to make sense of such a horrific event.
Exactly.
And that's where Said's essay, The Clash of Ignorance, comes in.
It's like a much-needed antidote to this overly simplistic us versus them thinking.
And he doesn't mince words.
No, he doesn't. He calls out Huntington for basically reducing the incredible richness and diversity of human civilization into these cartoonish caricatures.
It's like trying to understand the entirety of human experience just by looking at a handful of stereotypes, right?
Right.
What's fascinating, though, is that Said isn't denying that conflict exists. Instead, he's challenging the very lens through which we view these conflicts.
He's urging us to move beyond these reductive labels that just stifle critical thought.
And that's where his critique gets really interesting, at least for me. He doesn't just throw out broad criticisms, he backs it up with these powerful personal anecdotes. Like there's this one part where he talks about being confronted for wearing a suit.
A Western suit, apparently.
Right. During one of his lectures. I mean, can you imagine? It just perfectly highlights how absurd it is to assign these monolithic cultural labels onto individuals.
Right.
Or even entire groups of people.
It's especially jarring when you think about how interconnected our world has become.
Right.
Technology, for instance, it constantly traverses borders, cultures. Can we even really talk about Western technology anymore when you have innovation happening on a global scale? I think Said would argue these kinds of distinctions are becoming increasingly meaningless.
If they ever had much meaning to begin with.
Exactly.
And he doesn't stop there. He brings up these really striking examples like the Branch Davidians and Ayyum Shinrikyo to illustrate this danger of oversimplification. Now, these groups, they committed horrific acts of violence, but do they fit neatly into Huntington's Clash of Civilizations narrative? I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
Sen would argue that these cases might actually have more in common with someone like bin Laden than bin Laden has with, say, a shopkeeper in Morocco.
It's true.
By hyper-focusing on these massive simplistic labels, we risk overlooking the crucial nuances, the individual motivations, the very specific historical and political circumstances that contribute to these events. And it's not even just about missing the nuances, is it? This whole clash of civilizations mentality, it can become like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
If we're always on the lookout for these big clashes between cultures, we might end up creating them where they wouldn't have existed otherwise.
You're hitting on something really important there. Said argues that this us versus them framework, it isn't just inaccurate, it's actually dangerous. It fuels fear, prejudice, and ultimately it can even be used to justify, violence and oppression.
Yeah, and it's something Said really tackles head on when he talks about this whole good versus evil narrative.
Yeah.
The one that always seems to get slapped onto these so-called clashes.
Absolutely.
And he doesn't let us off the hook easily either.
No, he does not.
Said would say that buying into this kind of moral absolutism, where one side is totally good and the other is inherently evil, it prevents us from seeing the complexities.
The contradictions.
Yeah, within every culture and every conflict.
Exactly.
Think about it. How often do we see entire groups of people demonized just because of the actions of a few?
All the time.
Or these complex historical events boiled down to simple morality tales, like it's a children's storybook.
It's so easy to fall into that trap, though, right?
It is.
Especially when we're constantly bombarded with the news and opinions that just reinforce those narratives.
Totally. It's almost like our brains, they crave simplicity, that clear division between us and them.
It's comfortable, right?
Yeah. But Said challenges us to resist that urge, to dig a little deeper, to ask ourselves who really benefits from this kind of simplistic thinking, whose interests are being served by perpetuating these grand narratives of civilizational clash.
It's a really important question, and that's where I think Said's emphasis on reason really resonates. It's not just about rejecting simple narratives, it's about actively cultivating this mindset of critical inquiry, seeking out diverse perspectives and embracing, intellectual humility in the face of all these complex global challenges.
Absolutely.
He reminds us that knowledge, real understanding, empathy, these are the most powerful weapons we have against ignorance and fear. And ultimately, those are the tools that are going to help us build bridges instead of walls.
Exactly.
And he doesn't pretend to have all the answers either. In fact, he ends his essay with a question that's still so relevant even today.
Oh, tell me more about this question. What is it?
He asks, is it more helpful, more insightful, to put all our focus on these big, sweeping clashes of civilizations? Or should we be paying more attention to what he calls the bewildering interdependence that actually defines our world?
Bewildering interdependence. I like that. What does he mean by that?
An interdependence, he says, that's woven through centuries of trade, migration, cultural exchange.
And yeah, even conflict.
Right.
It's like someone handed us this giant right. But instead of trying to figure out all the pieces and how they fit together, we're told to just cram them into a few predetermined shapes. It might look neat and tidy from far away, but it doesn't really reflect what's actually going on, does it?
Not at all. And it also prevents us from truly appreciating the world in all its messy, complicated glory. Look, Said isn't saying we should pretend these differences don't exist. He's just urging us to look past the surface.
To acknowledge the shared history, the connections.
Right, and even the disagreements, all those things have shaped how cultures interact with each other.
It reminds me of that saying, if all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail.
Oh, I like that.
Huntington, he hands us this clash of civilizations hammer, and all of a sudden, we're seeing potential battle lines everywhere, even when those dividing lines might not even be real.
Exactly. And that's the biggest danger with these overly simplistic narratives. They limit how we see the present, but they also make it harder to imagine a different future.
A future that isn't all about conflict.
Yes. One where people and cultures are working together instead of constantly battling each other.
That's why I find Said's work so interesting. He's not just like critiquing some theory. He's basically issuing a challenge. He wants us to embrace nuance, to really resist those easy answers, to face the complexity of the world head on, even if it makes us a little uncomfortable sometimes.
He's reminding us that this isn't just some intellectual exercise, something we do for fun in our spare time. These ideas, the way we talk about these big issues, the language we use it all, has a real impact on the world.
Because words have power.
Exactly. It shapes policies, it fuels prejudice, it can even ignite conflicts or make them worse.
That's a really sobering thought.
Yeah.
So deep diving friend, the next time you see one of those headlines, the ones, about civilizations clashing, remember what Said said. Don't shy away from complexity. Don't let those simple narratives off the hook.
Ask tough questions, seek out different points of view, and never underestimate how important understanding and empathy really are.
Because when it comes down to it, isn't that the kind of world we all want to live in? A world where we can talk to each other honestly, celebrate what makes us different, and work together to solve problems. That's our deep dive for today. We hope it gave you a lot to think about. And who knows, maybe even sparked a little bit of hope. Hope for a future that's all about understanding and connection instead of just division and conflict. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and keep diving deep.